So that's my opening statement.
Senator Hughes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Professor Kelly, for coming in this afternoon. I know you're incredibly busy dealing with Victoria at the moment. But one of the things over the last couple of days has been an awful lot of, I think, what we could qualify as misinformation with regards to hotel quarantine, and this table obviously helps distill some of that. But if we could just go back to the beginning and please outline the development and the background of how hotel quarantine was set up in Australia and whether or not hotel quarantine is considered a public health matter.
Thanks for the question, Senator. So I think the Secretary has given advice on this previously when he was the Chief Medical Officer. He was at National Cabinet on the 27th of March last year, where a decision was made to, around the borders more generally, but particularly and specifically looking at quarantine arrangements on people coming across that border. So that was done at National Cabinet. National Cabinet, as the committee knows, is a combination of the Prime Minister and the First Ministers from each of the states and territories. This was a unanimous and combined decision. Very specifically, the detail of who was responsible for what was decided at that meeting. And as the Secretary has mentioned before, there were very clear and documented steps about how that should happen, what the Commonwealth's role was, and what the state and territories' role were. This is clearly a public health matter. That was why the decision was made. It's probably the most important thing we've done in relation to keeping Australia safe since that time. There's a lot of questions we've had in this committee and others about types of quarantine. The key important part is you get the public health issues right. And the public health workforce sits in the states. My colleagues on AHPPC have ample and very experienced people to do that work, and that is why they chose to do it.
So it'd be fair to say, though, that when National Cabinet agreed to hotel quarantine, the fact that the public health was the priority and that states have a primary responsibility for public health, that it was agreed at that National Cabinet that states would then therefore take a significant, if not leading role with regards to quarantine.
Yeah.
And I understand, I actually saw a little clip last week after that meeting where Dan Andrews took full credit for bringing that idea to National Cabinet. So I'm sure the Victorian government's incredibly grateful for that at the moment. So how many people have gone through hotel quarantine since the 27th of March 2020? And I know you just mentioned a positivity rate, but maybe if you can go through that again. So I think you just said it was over 3,000 people have gone. No, so what's the number of people that have gone through, the number of people that have been positive? Yeah. And you have mentioned with the incursions going into the community that I just did some math quickly on it. So what's extraordinary is you've got 6 of the 21 and 6 of the 21 were New South Wales and WA. And extraordinarily, Victoria, who has only had 5, has managed 4 lockdowns versus the other states. So perhaps it's not the hotel quarantine and any transmission that's the actual issue here. But if you could maybe just go through those numbers for us so everyone can start to get an actual sense of the scale of travellers coming home, number of positive tests, and then how that's actually been contained within the quarantine system.
So thank you. Yes, I think I might have said 385 earlier. It's 358,500 up until the 28th. From the 28th of March until earlier this week. There have been further flights in over the last few days, but let's keep that figure over 350,000. 3,900 COVID-19 cases have been diagnosed during that period, so it's just over 1%, and that's been fairly steady, except for a couple of occasions where it's bumped up, most recently in relation to Indian arrivals. So 358,000, 3,900 positives, and of those, six occasions where that's gone into the wider community. Been picked up very quickly, and in different states have decided in different ways to deal with those matters, but ultimately, particularly since October last year, that's been quickly and very successful in the control. Of course, in Victoria right now, they're reliving, I would imagine, my colleagues and friends down in Victoria, the events of last year, and that's totally understandable. My hearts go out to them in relation to that. But I have full confidence that the Victorian system has improved a lot since last year, and their contact tracers are continuing to do an extraordinarily good job and finding people very quickly. We, again, the Commonwealth offered assistance in regard to that today at AHPPC. We were told that they are coping well. And in fact, the common operating picture that we do look at for those things was introduced after the Victorian wave last year to make sure that we did know how states were doing in terms of their contact tracing, what pressure was on in terms of their hotel quarantine system, for example, how their testing was going, and on all of those measures. Victoria is doing a remarkable job. They're, again, over 50,000 tests yesterday. The turnaround time at the 97% are still coming back within 48 hours. They're getting to their primary and secondary close and more distant contacts quite quickly.
But I mean, just to confirm as well, being a senator for New South Wales and taking a particular amount of pride in the very much the gold standard that's being set in my home state, those 358,000 return travellers, the vast majority of those have been quarantined in New South Wales.
Over half.
Over half in New South Wales. So I guess, also when we look at Victoria and the failure that we're seeing at the moment with its hotel quarantine, the numbers, they're not actually... Would you mind, Senator White? I gave you the courtesy of listening to your questions a number of times.
Professor Kelly, the hotel quarantine breach was South Australia, wasn't it? In the Victorian instance?
Senator White.
Well,
Senator Polly.
Well, I think it's where we'll see the outbreaks in Victoria, and let's
Senator
get the
Hughes.
contact tracing there, shall we?
Order.
And Senator Polly, once again,
Senator
I gave
Hughes.
you guys the courtesy
Senator
of
Hughes.
listening to the same questions on repetition.
Senator Hughes,
If you
direct
wouldn't
your
mind while I
questions to the
spice things up
CMO.
a bit with a few different questions. It'd be
Order.
fantastic. Anyway, so just making the observation that New South Wales has taken over half of those quarantine travellers, yet has experienced less lockdowns than any other state. Any other state. So let's bundle them all in together. But we know Victoria is winning one race, and that would be the lockdown race. So, just finishing up on that one though, with regards to aerosols, I know there's been some questions around aerosols, the role that they might have played in transmission. If you can perhaps educate the committee, because surprisingly none of us are epidemiologists. You wouldn't know that, but I'm pretty sure you'll find there's not an epidemiologist around this table.
Thanks, Senator. I think yesterday I managed to talk about aerosols 3 times, and to remind the committee and hopefully anyone else that's listening that the Commonwealth does recognise that this virus is spread by people through the air. That is the main way it is spread. And some of that spread is via aerosol. Very small particles can move around quite far. They can stay in an indoor environment in particular for quite some time, and so today one of the cases that was reported from Victoria that appears to have been the case, someone where it was a rather casual contact.
In an indoor environment,
in an indoor
so
environment.
claims that you need to wear masks while out jogging, probably not appropriate.
Not high risk, but I'll leave that to my public health colleagues in the states to decide what's appropriate for their state. But in general terms, there is a range of ways that this virus can be transmitted. We've always said that some of those is via aerosols. In indoor environments where there are people that are stuck, and Senator Watt quoted me from a previous Senate hearing, my view of that in particular in relation to corridors within hotel quarantine. This has come up in several of the reviews about how important it is that environment is very carefully monitored. The increased use of CCTV, for example, rather than what was previously the case of security guards sitting outside doors in corridors, high risk, no longer happens. The use of appropriate masks in those sort of situations, that's been learnt through those various reviews. Doing as much as possible in a remote way, and this is one of the things that's important in Howard Springs. It's not just the physical environment of Howard Springs, but the way that they do a lot of their checking in on people via telehealth. Okay. And so these are things that we've learnt, and as I said, every week we discuss and share those learnings at AHPPC.
Okay, so just coming to the AHPPC, and obviously you're the chair of that, and I'm sure Senator Watt's very much looking forward to his bedtime reading with that, all the reports you've just tabled. Can you maybe run through some additional learnings and the recommendations that have been made from them? Because obviously you've just acknowledged that there's been learnings and there's been changes made. What we're hearing a lot of over the past 2 days is people with great 2020 hindsight vision, nothing really looking forward. This is unprecedented times. It's a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. Could you maybe run us through some of the learnings and continuous improvements that you've made outside of just those couple of few that you mentioned across all the state and territory facilities?
So it's. It is actually difficult to remember back to the beginning where we started. There were some clear guidance of what we were doing at that time. It was certainly a commitment to keep people for 2 weeks. That's continued. Mm-hmm. We're looking now at what might be done differently once the vaccination rolls out further, and particularly people that are crossing the border who have been vaccinated. But for now, that 2 weeks has remained solid. That's been a key component. Early on, we did one test when people arrived, and that was it. Now we're doing multiple tests for people that are in quarantine. That's been a learning through this period. We're now considering whether tests should be done in the week following quarantine, whether that's something that might be of value. That was discussed today at AHPPC. So we're continuing to learn. I think many of the issues I raised about yesterday, about the fact that we know more about the virus, and the virus has changed. We now have Greek letters for our variants of concern, and we're up to Kappa, and so that's halfway through the alphabet already, Greek alphabet. The issues of how there is movement of staff, and what type of staff, and what type of protection for staff, all of those things have been learnt through this period and through those reviews. The way that people are spaced in hotels, the types of hotels that are used, the ventilation that is used. Multiple of those reviews have looked specifically at ventilation in hotel quarantine, between rooms, in rooms, from room to corridor. Some of the timing of when people are moved and meals are delivered, for example. Things that like the use of nebulizers in rooms, that was a particular issue that came up and was immediately shared with the rest of AHPPC, so that did not happen again as a high-risk activity. There are so many. If you look through that table, and I encourage senators to look at the full documents I've put there. The Coast Review has, I think, 78 recommendations, and there are multiple recommendations from each of the other reviews. Each of those have been looked at in turn. Each of them have led to quality improvement, and every week we discuss this at AHPPC. We share across the nation, and those things are adopted and incorporated by the states and territories who are running the hotel quarantine. So that they are our guidelines. They've informed our guidelines, and the things that they do go beyond the guidelines. There is a minimum set of things that we expect. Each state and territory has gone beyond that.
And just a final question, if I can, Chair. Australia seems to have weathered this storm. I mean, even economically today, we've seen a return to economic figures that are pre-pandemic levels. We seem to have a very different epidemiology of the virus in Australia, and seem to be weathering it not only from an economic perspective but also from a health perspective. We are seeing considerably less deaths. We're seeing less waves through the population. Australia seems to be in a very different position than most other countries around the world. I'm just wondering if you could give us your views or an update on what sort of impact border restrictions, hotel quarantine and those sorts of activities that we've put in place and controls that the government's looked after that have contributed, perhaps to that epidemiology, perhaps to that success in the health side of managing this virus.
So I think what I would see is it's a key component of what could be imagined as rings of containment. And some of the other learnings we've had from hotel quarantine is the importance to add extra rings of containment outside of Australia. So under the Biosecurity Act, there have been a requirement, for example, in the last since January, to have pre-flight testing before people board a flight. The use of masks has been mandated in international as well as domestic carriers, but particularly international. The hotel quarantine, very key, the most key, I would say, ring of containment. And then all of the other measures that we've taken in terms of strengthening our public health response in all the states and territories, and they can all be commended in how much they've done in relation to training up their staff, having those systems in place, sharing data, having their QR codes, another ring of containment, making case finding and the contact tracing exercise much more efficient and quicker. The way we've scaled up our testing capability from a few thousand to, so yesterday I believe over 50,000, and that's been maintained over 40,000 in Victoria alone, is extraordinary. The ability to not only do genomic analysis, which was something we could not do at the start of this pandemic easily. Now, usually on the same day, if not the next day, we get quite detailed genomic analysis, which assists us enormously in tracing down those chains of transmission. So all of these are the ways that we've protected Australia from the virus, and we have a very unusual experience of the virus here in Australia in terms of the numbers of cases and the numbers of deaths, tragic as they are, compared with many other countries that are very similar to us. And I think our border controls, including quarantine, the vast majority of that in hotels, has been enormously successful.
No, thank you so much, Professor Kelly. I hope that clarifies a lot of it for everybody else at the table.
Thank you, Senator.
Here.